The mysterious disappearance in a small town. The sinister case of Sarah Johnson. Every small town has its own legends. A place where everyone knows each other, where life flows peacefully and predictably. But sometimes, even in such quiet places, something happens that turns everything upside down, leaving locals shocked, confused, and fearful. The incident becomes more than just a story. It becomes a dark thread that weaves its way into the fabric of the town's identity, haunting its residents for years. The story I will tell you today happened in such a small town, a place where whispers of the unspeakable circulate long after the sun goes down. It is here that a young woman named Sarah Johnson disappeared, leaving behind only riddles, broken hearts, and unanswered questions that still hang heavy in the air. The morning call. It all began on a crisp, cool autumn morning. The kind of morning that should have felt peaceful. The sun peeked through golden leaves, casting a soft glow across the town. There was a slight chill in the air, a reminder that winter was just around the corner. The streets were unusually quiet, with only the sound of dry leaves crunching underfoot. But that calm was deceptive, masking the dark truth that was about to unfold. Sarah Johnson didn't show up at her job at the local library that morning, which was very unusual for her. Sarah was the type of person who never missed a day of work, no matter the circumstance. She was dependable, responsible, and always on time. So when her absence stretched into the late morning, her colleagues began to worry. At first, they assumed she might have fallen ill. Maybe she was feeling unwell and hadn't had the chance to call. But as the minutes turned to hours and the phone remained silent, the uneasy feeling in the pit of their stomachs began to grow. Emma, Sarah's best friend and co-worker, couldn't shake the sense of dread that settled over her. She tried to focus on her work, organizing books and checking out customers, but her mind kept drifting back to Sarah. It wasn't like her to just disappear. She was the type of person who would still show up, even if she had a fever. Emma found herself glancing at the clock more and more frequently, each passing minute amplifying her anxiety. Something was wrong. Deep down, she knew it. By noon, Emma couldn't take it anymore. The knot in her stomach had tightened to the point where it was difficult to breathe. She dialed Sarah's number, but it went straight to voicemail. The emptiness on the other end of the line sent chills down her spine. Her mind raced. Was Sarah okay? Was she hurt? Was she missing? The visit to Sarah's apartment. By the end of the workday, Emma had decided to take matters into her own hands. She needed to see Sarah, to hear her voice, to make sure everything was fine. She drove quickly through the quiet streets to Sarah's apartment, her heart pounding in her chest. The usually familiar drive now felt foreign, every shadowed corner and narrow alley adding to her growing fear. When she arrived at Sarah's building, the place seemed eerily silent, as if the world was holding its breath. The trees around the building swayed slightly in the evening breeze, their bare branches scraping against the windows. Emma hurried up the stairs, her footsteps echoing in the narrow hallway. She knocked on Sarah's door, her hand trembling slightly. "Sarah?" Emma called out, her voice breaking the silence. She knocked again, louder this time. "Sarah, are you in there?" Still nothing. No response. The unsettling quietness sent a wave of cold fear through her. Emma tried the doorknob, but it was locked. She knocked again, harder this time, her fist pounding against the door. Her heart was racing now, her mind filled with terrible possibilities. Was Sarah lying unconscious inside? Or worse? Emma's thoughts spiraled, each one darker than the last. After several minutes of frantic knocking, Emma decided to ask the neighbors. She ran down the hallway, her voice shaky as she knocked on the nearest door. A kind, elderly woman answered, her brow furrowed with concern as Emma explained the situation. The neighbor confirmed that she had seen Sarah the previous evening. Sarah had returned home just after dark, looking as calm and composed as ever. She had smiled and waved, the same way she always did. Nothing had seemed out of the ordinary. But now, standing in front of her locked door, Emma felt a deep chill settle over her. Something was definitely wrong. The police report. The next morning, when there was still no word from Sarah, Emma and her colleagues decided to contact the police. The weight of their concern had grown too heavy to bear alone. Although the disappearance of an adult doesn't typically result in an immediate police response, the fact that the town was small and that Sarah was known to be responsible and reliable prompted the authorities to act quickly. Officer Stan Peterson, a seasoned investigator with over 2 decades of service, was assigned to the case. He was well acquainted with Sarah, having seen her around town for years. She was quiet, thoughtful, and never one to cause trouble. Her sudden disappearance didn't make sense, and that alone raised red flags for Peterson. He had seen too many cases where seemingly ordinary situations took dark and unexpected turns. The first place Peterson visited was Sarah's apartment. When he arrived, the building was bathed in the early morning light, but the atmosphere was thick with unease. As he approached her door, Peterson noticed there were no signs of forced entry. The lock was intact, and the door appeared untouched. He knocked, but just like Emma had experienced the day before, there was no response. Using a spare key provided by the landlord, Peterson cautiously entered the apartment. Inside, everything seemed normal, too normal. Her belongings were in place. Her phone and bag sat on the kitchen counter as if she had just returned home from work. The apartment wasn't in disarray. There were no signs of a struggle. It was as if Sarah had simply vanished, leaving her life behind. The stillness of the apartment felt suffocating, as if the walls themselves held secrets. Peterson stood in the center of the room, scanning every detail. The more he looked, the stranger it seemed. How could someone just disappear so suddenly, with no signs of foul play? He could feel the weight of the mystery pressing down on him, like an invisible hand tightening around his throat. This was not going to be a simple case. The investigation begins. The investigation officially kicked off, with Peterson and his team interviewing everyone who knew Sarah. First on the list were her parents. Linda, Sarah's mother, was inconsolable. Tears streamed down her face as she clutched a photo of her daughter, her hands trembling. Peterson listened intently as Linda described Sarah as the light of her life, someone who had no enemies, no known troubles. Her voice cracked with every word, and Peterson could feel the raw pain in every syllable. Sarah was a good person, she insisted. She would never just disappear. Peterson tried to reassure Linda, but deep down, he knew the situation was growing more troubling by the hour. He could see it in her eyes, the motherly intuition that something terrible had happened. That fear was infectious, spreading from Linda to everyone who spoke about Sarah. Emma, still reeling from the shock of her friend's disappearance, couldn't understand it either. She kept replaying her last conversation with Sarah in her mind, searching for any hidden clues. They had discussed their plans for the weekend. Sarah had seemed fine, happy, even. She hadn't mentioned anything out of the ordinary, nothing that would suggest she was in danger or troubled. Emma was certain that something horrible had happened. But what? As the police expanded their interviews to casual acquaintances and neighbors, they finally got their first real lead. A man who lived on the floor above Sarah's apartment mentioned something strange. 2 days before her disappearance, he had noticed a dark car parked outside the building late at night. This was unusual because in a small town like theirs, everyone knew each other's vehicles. The car didn't belong to anyone local. What made the sight even stranger was the behavior of the man inside the car. The neighbor described him as nervous, glancing around constantly as if he was waiting for something or someone. The car stayed there for hours, parked in the shadows, before disappearing into the night. The next day, Sarah was gone. This revelation sent a shiver down Peterson's spine. Who was this man? And why was he waiting outside Sarah's building so late? The team immediately began searching for surveillance footage in the area, but to their frustration, there were no cameras positioned near Sarah's apartment that could have captured the car's license plate or the driver's face. It was as if this stranger had slipped into the town and vanished, just like Sarah, a town on edge. As the days passed with no new leads, the tension in the town began to escalate. The once peaceful community was now gripped by fear. People started locking their doors at night, something they hadn't done in years. Mothers held their children a little closer, and neighbors began eyeing each other with suspicion. Everyone was on edge. Whispers spread like wildfire. Rumors of who might be responsible, of dark secrets lurking beneath the town's quiet surface. Had Sarah been taken by someone local? Was there a predator in their midst? Or had she left on her own, fleeing some hidden danger no one knew about. The questions swirled, and with each passing day, hope of finding Sarah alive began to dwindle. But just when it seemed like the trail had gone cold, a new witness came forward, and the investigation took a chilling turn. A witness comes forward. Days passed, and with every passing hour, the hope of finding Sarah dwindled. The town, once brimming with small-town warmth, was now shrouded in fear. People whispered in hushed tones, speculating about what might have happened to Sarah. The familiar sight of her walking down the street, smiling at passers-by, now seemed like a distant memory. It was as though the town itself had lost a part of its soul when Sarah disappeared. Just as Peterson began to fear that the trail had gone cold, a new witness came forward, offering the first sliver of hope in days. His name was Jack, a young man who worked at the small grocery store near Sarah's apartment. Jack remembered seeing her on the day she vanished. The memory of that day was now etched into his mind, clearer than ever before. She came into the store, Jack recalled, his brow furrowed in concentration as he spoke to Peterson. It was just like any other day, except something was off about her. She looked worried. Peterson leaned forward, his notepad ready. Worried how? She kept looking over her shoulder, as if she was expecting someone. Or maybe even avoiding someone, Jack continued. She was in a hurry. She grabbed a few things, paid quickly, and left. But before she walked out the door, she paused for a moment. I swear she looked right at me, as if she wanted to say something. But then, she left. The detective's pen hovered over his notepad. This was more than they had gotten from anyone else. Did you notice where she went afterward? Jack nodded. Yeah, I saw her leave the store and get into a car parked just outside. A dark car. The same one the neighbor had described. Peterson felt a familiar chill crawl up his spine. Did you get a look at the driver? Jack's face darkened, a flicker of frustration flashing in his eyes. Not really. I didn't think much of it at the time, but I did notice he was wearing a black coat and he seemed off, like tense. He kept glancing around. And Sarah, she didn't look scared, exactly, but she looked uneasy. This new piece of information deepened the mystery. Peterson's mind raced. Who was this driver? What was their connection to Sarah? And why did Sarah willingly get into the car if she seemed so uncomfortable? These questions only added more layers to an already tangled case. The detective felt the weight of every unanswered question hanging over him. Digging deeper, dark pages of the past. Frustrated by the lack of progress, Peterson decided to dig deeper into Sarah's past, hoping that something, anything, might shed light on the situation. Perhaps there were secrets no one knew about. People often kept parts of their lives hidden, even from those closest to them. As he combed through Sarah's background, Peterson came across something that no one had mentioned before. Several years earlier, Sarah had been in a relationship with a man named Mark Davies. At first glance, it seemed like any other failed relationship, but as Peterson delved further, he found troubling details. After their breakup, Mark had become obsessive. He had tried to contact Sarah multiple times, even showing up at her apartment unannounced. He had stalked her, followed her home from work on several occasions. Sarah, being the private person she was, had never told her family or friends about the extent of Mark's behavior. She didn't want to worry them. But now, with her disappearance, Peterson couldn't help but wonder. Could Mark have something to do with this? Mark Davies became the prime suspect in Peterson's eyes. He lived in a neighboring town, which would explain why no one in Sarah's small community recognized him or the car. Peterson decided to pay Mark a visit, hoping to confront him and gather more information. When he arrived at Mark's home, the man was calm, too calm. His confidence was unnerving. Peterson had dealt with suspects like this before, the ones who seemed too sure of themselves, as if they had rehearsed their lines. Mark insisted he hadn't seen Sarah in years and had no reason to harm her. His answers were smooth, almost rehearsed, but when Peterson brought up the car seen outside Sarah's building, Mark faltered for a moment. His brief hesitation wasn't much, but to a seasoned detective like Peterson, it was enough to plant a seed of doubt. Mark denied being anywhere near Sarah's town recently, but his nervous reaction gave Peterson reason to suspect otherwise. The police decided to search Mark's home, but came up empty. There were no obvious signs that he had been involved in Sarah's disappearance. However, Peterson knew better than to assume innocence simply because there was no immediate proof. Some criminals were skilled at covering their tracks. A town gripped by fear. As the investigation dragged on, the town's atmosphere grew darker. Fear had seeped into every corner of the community, transforming it into a place of suspicion and paranoia. Once friendly neighbors now eyed each other warily. Parents began escorting their children to school, even if it was just down the block. No one felt safe. The disappearance of Sarah Johnson had cast a long shadow over their peaceful town. Peterson felt the pressure mounting. Weeks had passed with no significant breakthroughs, and the trail seemed to be growing colder by the day. He replayed every detail in his mind, searching for something he might have missed. The image of Sarah getting into that dark car haunted him. What had she been thinking? Had she gone willingly, or had she felt coerced? The answers continued to elude him. Then, 2 months after Sarah's disappearance, an unexpected call came into the station. It was an anonymous tip from a man who identified himself as Paul, a taxi driver from a nearby city. Paul claimed to have overheard a disturbing conversation between 2 men who had been riding in his cab. One of them had mentioned the name Sarah. The other had spoken about a girl causing trouble and mentioned something about an abandoned factory on the outskirts of town. A chilling discovery. Armed with this new information, Peterson and his team immediately rushed to the location. The factory was a relic of the past, a crumbling structure that had been abandoned for years. Its broken windows and decaying walls gave it an ominous presence, the kind of place that sent a shiver down your spine just looking at it. Inside, the atmosphere was even more oppressive. Dust clung to every surface, and the air was thick with the stench of decay. As they ventured deeper into the factory, they stumbled upon a small, hidden room. What they found inside was horrifying. The room had been transformed into a makeshift prison. The walls were covered in scratches, as though someone had tried to claw their way out. There were chains bolted to the floor, and old food wrappers and discarded water bottles lay scattered about. The signs were clear. Sarah had been held here. But Sarah wasn't there now. Whoever had kept her captive had moved her before the police arrived. Peterson's heart sank as the grim reality set in. They were close, but not close enough. The final breakthrough. The investigation took a new direction after the factory discovery. It became a manhunt for the person responsible for Sarah's abduction. Peterson and his team continued their relentless search for answers, and eventually, the pieces began to fall into place. After weeks of surveillance and gathering evidence, they finally caught a break. It was Mark Davies. The man who had once obsessed over Sarah couldn't let go of his desire for control. He had kidnapped her, driven by a twisted sense of revenge for her rejection years earlier. He had held her captive at the factory, trying to force her to admit her mistake and return to him. When he realized the investigation was closing in, he had panicked and moved her. Under the weight of the mounting evidence, Mark confessed. The confession was chilling. He described how he had planned the entire thing, how he had watched Sarah from afar, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. His obsession had consumed him, turning his desire for Sarah into something dark and dangerous. The aftermath. Sarah was eventually found alive, but deeply traumatized. She had endured weeks of psychological and physical torment at the hands of a man she had once known. Her recovery would be long and difficult, both for her and for the community that had been so deeply affected by her disappearance. The town, once a symbol of peace and tranquility, was forever changed by the events that had unfolded. The fear that had gripped the community slowly began to fade, but the scars remained. Sarah's story became a cautionary tale, a reminder that darkness can lurk even in the most peaceful places. What do you think of this case? Could you have predicted the ending earlier? If you enjoyed this story, leave your thoughts in the comments. This video was narrated by a neural network.